The most delicious thing a fantasy drama can do is look you dead in the eye and say, you know that guy everyone keeps stepping over, and then slowly slide a crown, a prophecy, and a planet-level secret into his hands while the so-called geniuses are still busy posturing. Main Lemah, tapi Kuat lives in that exact satisfaction. It opens with this big, shiny, imperial premise that feels almost familiar on purpose: an empire, a princess, a tournament, the political theater of choice, and then it yanks the floor out from under the entire room with one act of divine violence that I swear I felt in my chest. And yes, I watched this with the, okay, impress me, face on, and it still got me. You're on Bongo Gaming with me, and if you end up liking the way I break these down, consider subscribing, just one click, no pressure. I'm going to keep this at a moderate spoiler level. I'll talk about the setup, the turning points that are basically the premise anyway, and the kind of story it becomes, but I'm not here to bulldoze the endgame surprises. So, Kaiser and Aurelian. Even the name sounds like polished marble. The show's first big move is to stage this tournament to find a husband for Putri Isolde, and right away you can tell it's not just about romance, it's about control. It's about optics. It's about letting the empire pretend it's modern and benevolent while still treating a woman's future like a national resource. And the drama doesn't need to have a character look into the camera and say that. It's in the way the court smiles too widely, the way the contenders are framed like product displays, the way the crowd cheers like they're being paid per decibel. There's a specific kind of energy in those early tournament scenes. Again, I'm not going to pretend I can name every round or every opponent because the show isn't really about who swings the sharpest sword. It's about who gets watched. The camera loves the spectacle, but it also lingers on the edges of it. On the servants resetting the arena. On the nobles whispering like they're betting on horses. On Isolde's face when she realizes her choice is basically a curated menu. And then the North crashes the party. A criminal from the North, described and treated like this barbaric omen, starts rampaging, and the show uses that moment to reveal its real genre. Up until then, you might think you're in a political romance with a tournament gimmick. But the second that Northern Penjahat steps into the story, it becomes something else, a mystery about power, about who gets labeled a monster, and about the terrifying fact that there are forces above the empire that do not care about its rules. Here's the mini-scene that sold me, and I'm going to paint it the way it felt. You've got the arena or the ceremonial grounds, some big public space dressed in banners and gold and all that imperial confidence. The crowd is mid-roar, the kind of roar that makes you feel like history is happening. And then the sound drops out in a way that's not subtle. It's like somebody put a hand over the world's mouth. The northern criminal is chaos incarnate for a few breaths, wild movement, guards panicking, that sharp human fear that spreads faster than any spell, until this mantra dua mysterious hits, and the person doesn't fall, doesn't bleed out, doesn't get dramatically defeated. They get erased. Vaporized. The show doesn't play it as a cool magic trick. It plays it like a warning. That moment is doing so much work. Visually, it's a flex. Tonally, it's a threat. Thematically, it's the show telling you, you are not watching a story where human institutions are the top of the food chain. And emotionally? It's unsettling. Because everyone in that crowd is suddenly equal. Princess, peasant, champion, criminal, it doesn't matter. Whatever that god phrase was, it could have taken anyone. And that's when Kale steps in. Kale, the Penyihir Utama, the chief mage, becomes the audience's anchor, but not in a cozy way. He's not the warm mentor figure who explains the rules with a twinkle in his eye. The vibe I got is that Kale is competent with a price tag. The kind of man who has spent so long being the smartest person in the room that he started believing it's a moral position. When he investigates the vaporization, the show shifts gears into investigation mode, and I love that it doesn't treat magic like a plot coupon. It treats it like forensics. Like an impossible crime scene where the evidence is absence. And listen, I'm a sucker for smart character actually being smart, but I'm also picky about it. I don't like when shows cheat and just have someone announce the answer because the script says so. Main Lemah, tapi Kuat makes Kale work. The pacing slows down in a deliberate way here. Some people are going to call it a drag, and I get it, but for me it was tension. Because Kale isn't just chasing who did it. He's chasing what kind of power can do that. And what it means that it happened in public. If you've ever had that feeling in a story where the grown-ups realize they are not the grown-ups anymore, that's the vibe. The Empire is all ceremony until something divine turns a human being into mist and suddenly everyone's traditions look like paper. Now here's where the show earns its title, and where I started grinning like an idiot. Because Kale's investigation leads him to the person who actually executed that godlike spell, and it's not the obvious candidate. It's not the crowned head. It's not the secret priest in the shadows. It's Lucien, the guy everyone calls a loser. The dude who has apparently been catching contempt like it's rain. The one the story has trained you, on purpose, to overlook. That reveal, again, premise level, not endgame, isn't just a gotcha. It's a character thesis. The show is basically asking, how often do we confuse social power with real power? How often do we decide who is weak based on who gets laughed at? And when the truth shows up, do we recognize it, or do we punish it for embarrassing us? And the funniest part is, the drama doesn't even frame Lucien like a triumphant superhero right away. It frames him like a problem. Like an anomaly the Empire can't file. And that's so much more interesting than if everyone immediately bowed and said, "Oh my God, the chosen one." No. People cling to their previous opinion of him. They try to rationalize it. They minimize it. They do that very human thing where, when you confront it with someone you underestimated, you don't immediately upgrade your respect, you look for a way to keep your ego intact. There's a quiet cruelty in that, and the show doesn't soften it. One of the strongest choices here, and I'm going to plant my flag on this early, is that main Lemah, Kuat doesn't make its loser lovable in a pandering way. Lucien isn't presented as pathetic puppy energy who just needs a hug. He's presented as someone who has been shaped by ridicule. That's different. That has teeth. When you live as the joke long enough, you don't come out of it sparkling and innocent. You come out guarded. You come out strategic. You come out with a relationship to power that is complicated, because power is the thing that hurt you and the thing you might need to survive. And now, put him in the same story as Isolde. Because while Kale is doing his investigation and the court is scrambling to control the narrative, Isolde is still in the middle of this tournament machine built around her. The show's balancing act is that it could have easily made her a pure victim, a sweet princess trapped by tradition. But the way it's written, and again, I'm keeping it general because I'm not going to invent specific, she did X in episode Y, events, it feels like Isolde is sharper than the people around her assume. She's not just sitting pretty waiting for rescue. She's observing. She's learning how the room moves when she shifts her weight. There's a particular kind of performance required to play royalty in a drama like this. You have to look composed while your insides are on fire. And the actress playing Isolde sells that with micro-choices, tiny pauses before she speaks, a controlled breath, that slight tightening around the eyes that says, "I'm doing math while you think I'm decorating." I love that. Because the tournament isn't just a romantic obstacle, it's a political trap. If she refuses, she's ungrateful or rebellious. If she chooses wrong, she destabilizes alliances. If she chooses right, she becomes a symbol someone else can wield. So when this divine vaporization happens, it doesn't just raise the stakes in a fun fantasy way. It threatens the entire system Isolde is trapped in. Suddenly the Empire has to ask, what good is a husband selection tournament if a god can erase a person mid-rampage? What do titles matter against that? And that leads to one of the show's best ongoing tensions. Kale represents institutional magic, sanctioned power, knowledge with a badge. Lucien represents something else. Something that smells like the divine, or the forbidden, or the overlooked. And Isolde is caught between these forces like a live wire. Here's a question that kept pulling me forward every time the plot slowed down. What does each of these characters believe power is for? Kale seems like the type who believes power is for order, for containment, for preventing embarrassment to the state. Lucien, from what we're given, feels like someone who might believe power is for survival first, and justice second, and maybe those things don't always align. And Isolde. Isolde's power is social, symbolic, strategic. Until it isn't. The show's title, Main Lemah, Tapi Kuat, is obviously pointing at Lucien on the surface. The weak hand that's actually strong. The underestimated player. But I also think it's talking about the Empire. Because the Aurelian court looks strong. It looks unbreakable. It has banners and laws and rituals and shiny armor. But the second an unsanctioned divine spell hits in public, the whole thing starts to look fragile. Like a stage set. Like the kind of strength that only exists as long as nobody questions it. And that's where the cinematography and production design become more than just pretty fantasy show. The palette, at least in the way it reads emotionally, leans into that contrast between polished imperial warmth and the colder, harsher edge of whatever the North represents. Even when we're not physically in the North, the idea of it shows up as a temperature drop in the mood. The Empire is gold and ceremony. The North is iron and hunger. The divine spell is neither. It's blank. It's like an absence of color. A subtraction. Also, can we talk about costuming for a second? Not in a, let's list outfits, way, but in how it communicates hierarchy. The Aurelian court clothes feel like they're designed to remind you who owns air. Structured silhouettes, ornamental details, layers that restrict movement just enough to signal that freedom is not the point. Meanwhile Lucien, as the loser, is framed in a way that makes him blend into spaces, like someone you could overlook in a hallway. And the moment you realize he might be the most dangerous person in the story, you start noticing how that visual choice was the entire trick. That's good craft. That's a show trusting you to reread what you saw. Now, I'm going to give a respectful contrarian take here, because I can already hear the discourse in my head. A lot of people, especially in fantasy romance spaces, get tired of tournament arcs. They call them filler. They call them predictable. They call them an excuse for shirtless sparring and dramatic slow-mo. And sure, tournament arcs can be lazy. But in Main Lemah, Tapi Kuat, the tournament isn't the point, it's the petri dish. It's the controlled environment where the Empire displays its values. Who gets praised, who gets mocked, who gets judged worthy. It's not just who wins. It's who is allowed to compete, who is allowed to speak, who is allowed to refuse. So for me, the tournament framing actually does something smart. It gives the show a public stage where humiliation is normal. Which makes Lucien's social position, being openly ridiculed, feel baked into the world, not just a backstory detail. If the Empire can turn marriage into a spectator sport, of course it can turn a man into a joke. It's the same mechanism. Public consensus as a weapon. And then the divine spell interrupts that mechanism like a glitch. Like a god slamming a hand down on the chessboard. There's another thing the show does that I didn't expect to like as much as I did, the sound design around magic. A lot of dramas make magic sound like generic, whoosh, boom, shimmer, stuff. Here, the mantra dua mysterious moment has weight because it's quieter than you think it'll be. Or at least it's framed that way. It's not fireworks. It's authority. It's the sound of a door closing on reality. And when Kale investigates, the show uses little audio motifs, subtle pulses, a kind of tension hum, to make the investigation feel like you're listening for something that might not want to be found. Music-wise, it leans into that mix of regal themes for the court and more ominous textures for anything tied to the North or the divine. And again, I'm speaking in the emotional language of the score, not claiming there's a specific instrument every time. But there's this sense that the Empire's music wants to be heroic, while the show keeps undercutting it with unease. Which brings me to pacing. The first stretch has a strong hook with the tournament spectacle, and then it risks something by slowing down for Kale's investigation and Lucien's repositioning in the story. If you're the kind of viewer who needs constant fights, you might feel the shift. But I actually think that's where the drama is telling you what it values, not action for action's sake, but consequence. Because let's be real. A person got vaporized in public by an unknown god spell. If the story just went, anyway, back to the tournament, I'd have rolled my eyes so hard I'd see my own brain. The fact that it stops and lets that event contaminate everything is what makes the world feel real. The Empire panics. The court whispers. The institution of magic is embarrassed. Kale is pressured to produce answers because, I don't know, is not acceptable when you're the chief mage. And Lucien, who should be the key, is also the one person nobody wants to admit they misjudged. That last part is where the character writing really starts to hum. Because Lucien being the true caster isn't just a surprise, it's an indictment. The court's contempt becomes plot relevant. The way people treated him becomes evidence. And there's something deeply satisfying, maybe a little vindictive, if I'm being honest, about watching a room full of smug nobles realize that loser might be the only person who understands what just happened. Let me be a little vulnerable here. I have a soft spot for underdog stories, but only when they don't lie to me. I grew up being the quiet kid, not in the tragic movie way, just in the way where people assume quiet equals harmless, quiet equals nothing going on. So when a drama nails that feeling, when it captures the way being underestimated can turn into a kind of invisibility cloak, I feel it in my stomach. Lucien's arc, from what we're set up to expect, isn't, he becomes confident and everyone cheers. It's more like, he's been confident in private for a long time, the world just never gave him a reason to show it. That hits me. And it makes me watch Kale differently too. Because Kale isn't a bully in the obvious way, at least not in the premise we're given. He's not the guy throwing tomatoes. He's the guy who built the system that decides who matters. That's a different kind of antagonism. And it's the kind that makes for better drama because it's not cartoonish. What I appreciate is that the show doesn't immediately force Kale into a villain box. It lets him be alarming. It lets him be the person who might genuinely believe he's protecting the Empire while also being unable to imagine that someone like Lucien could be the answer. That's prejudice, sure, but it's also institutional blindness. And the writing, at least in the way the premise unfolds, understands that those are intertwined. Now, Isolde's position in all of this could have been the weak link. In a lot of shows, the princess in a tournament to choose a husband becomes a passive trophy while the men do plot. But I didn't get that vibe here. Even when she's constrained, she has presence. The way scenes are framed around her, she's often the still point while the chaos moves around her. And that's a kind of power. It's the show saying, watch her. She's absorbing all of this. She's going to make a decision at some point. The tournament makes her look like an object, but the camera doesn't always agree with the Empire's framing. Also, the chemistry possibilities are complicated in a way I enjoy. The obvious genre expectation is to ask, okay, is Lucien going to be the romantic match? Maybe. But there's also the triangle of ideology here. Kale and Lucien are two different relationships to magic. Isolde is the relationship to the state. Any romance that happens in that triangle isn't just attraction, it's alignment. It's choosing what kind of world you want to live in. And I like that the show's premise doesn't guarantee romance as an escape hatch. The husband tournament, by design, is a cage dressed as a celebration. So if romance happens, it has to fight through politics, not float above it. That makes every glance heavier. Every moment of unexpected respect matters. There's a specific kind of scene the show seems to like, a scene where a character is being watched by people who think they understand them. A courtly conversation where half the meaning is hidden. That's where the editing really comes in. Cuts linger just long enough to let you see the mask slip, then snap away before it becomes melodrama. Reaction shots are used like weapons. You'll see a noble smile, then a cut to Isolde's neutral face that reads like, noted. You'll see Kale's controlled stare, then a cut to Lucien being treated like background noise. The rhythm teaches you to look for what isn't being said. And because we're dealing with a divine spell and a mysterious god, the show has this undercurrent of spiritual horror that I did not expect from something that starts with a tournament. Not horror like jump scares, but horror like insignificance. The idea that a god can intervene, and nobody even knows which god it was, or why it cared enough to erase a criminal in that specific way. That mystery is a hook that isn't just, who did it, it's, what are we living under? I kept thinking about how different characters would interpret that event. The Empire would want to claim it, right? Or deny it. Or package it as a sign of divine favor. Religious institutions, if they exist in the story the way fantasy worlds usually do, would want to control the narrative. The public would turn it into superstition. And Kale, the mage, would want to explain it like a scientific anomaly because that's how he maintains his status, by being the person who names the unknown. But Lucian is the wild card. Because if he's truly the caster, then he either has access to something no one else has, or he is something no one else understands. And either possibility is terrifying to the people in power. Here's another rehook that kept me glued: does Lucian even want to be seen? Because being unseen protected him. Being seen is dangerous. The moment the court admits he's powerful, he becomes a resource to exploit or a threat to eliminate. And the show's title suggests strength, but it also suggests strain. Weak hand, that strong is still a hand people will try to use. Now let's talk performances in a more general way, because this drama lives and dies on whether you believe the social cruelty. If the mocking of Lucian feels cartoonish, the premise collapses. But the way it's staged, again, speaking from the vibe of the storytelling rather than pretending I have a transcript, it feels casual. Like people aren't even trying to be cruel, they are just comfortable. And that's worse. That's the kind of bullying that happens when the whole room agrees someone is lesser, so nobody feels accountable. The actors playing the court sell that entitlement with little laughs, little dismissive glances, the way they talk past him rather than to him. Lucian's performance, on the other hand, has to thread an impossible needle. He's mocked as a loser, but he's also secretly capable of divine-level magic. So how does he play that without tipping the twist? He can't be too confident, or you'd suspect. He can't be too pathetic, or the reveal feels like the show lied. The sweet spot is a kind of contained restraint. Like his choosing not to react because reacting would reveal something. And when the reveal lands, you recontextualize all those quiet moments as discipline, not weakness. Kale's actor has a different challenge: he has to be impressive without being lovable. Because if Kale is too charming, then the story loses tension, you just root for him to solve it, and move on. But Kale needs to feel like the embodiment of the Empire's ego. So his performance leans into precision. Controlled movement. Eyes that measure people. A voice that sounds like it's used to being obeyed. And the moments where that control cracks, where you can see genuine confusion or threat, those are the moments that make you realize how big this mystery is. Isolde's performance is probably the most quietly difficult, because she's surrounded by noise. A tournament, a court, a divine incident, a political storm. And she still has to feel like the emotional center of the show's moral question: what does a person do when they are treated as a symbol? The actress communicates that with stillness. With that royal posture that reads like strength, until you realize it's armor. And then you start looking for the moments where she's alone, where the armor is too heavy. One tiny human aside before I get too serious: I always judge fantasy dramas by how they handle fancy public events, because nothing takes me out faster than a crowd that looks like they were bribed with free snacks to stand there. Main Lemah, Kuat actually makes the tournament feel like a civic obsession. Like the city would genuinely show up. Like gossip would spread. Like it matters. And that sells everything else. The production design reinforces that too. The Aurelian Empire feels curated. Like power is aestheticized. Banners, marble, polished surfaces, ceremonial geometry. That matters because when something messy intrudes, like a northern criminal rampage, like divine vaporization, it stains the perfection. The contrast is the story. If the Empire already looked grimy and unstable, the divine event wouldn't feel like such a violation. And this is where editing becomes a storytelling tool instead of just a pacing mechanism. The show seems to understand when to linger on ritual and when to cut hard into panic. The tournament sequences have a rhythm of anticipation, crowd, performance, judgment. The rampage breaks that rhythm. The vaporization shatters it. And then the investigation rebuilds a new rhythm: observation, inference, pressure, denial. One of the more interesting thematic threads here is shame. Not guilt, shame. The Empire is ashamed that it can't control what happened. Kale is ashamed, in his own way, that he doesn't immediately understand the magic. The court is ashamed that the person they mocked might be the key. And Lucien. Lucien has likely been carrying shame that was assigned to him by others, which is its own kind of violence. Shame is a social emotion. It requires an audience. Which is why it's so fitting that this story begins with a tournament, the most literal audience-driven plot device possible. And if you've ever been in a room where people have decided who you are before you open your mouth, you'll recognize the feeling this show is playing with. That's why Lucien's reveal hits. It's not just, surprise, he's powerful. It's, surprise, you were complicit in not seeing him. Now, I want to be careful not to pretend the show is flawless, because even in the premise and early to mid-stretch, you can feel some risks. The biggest one is that the tournament framing can create an expectation of constant escalation, bigger opponents, bigger spectacle, and then the investigative arc can feel like a come-down if you came for adrenaline. That's a taste thing, but it's also a structural challenge. The show has to convince you that dialogue scenes carry the same threat as sword swings. For me, it mostly does, because the stakes are existential. The court isn't just trying to win a tournament. It's trying to prevent the public from realizing the Empire might be powerless under a god's gaze. But I can imagine some viewers bouncing off the slower, more political stretches if they expected a straightforward action fantasy. Another potential weak spot, depending on how you read it, is the mysterious god element. When you introduce divine intervention this early and this dramatically, you risk making human efforts feel pointless. Like, why do we care about a tournament if gods can just delete people? The reason it works here, at least so far, is because the divine power is not under anyone's control. It's not a convenient friend. It's not a solution. It's a problem that makes every human decision more desperate. And that's where Lucien becomes essential. Because if anyone can bridge the gap between human politics and divine force, it's the person who's apparently touched it. But again, that's not a blessing. That's a target on his back. There's also a really compelling moral ambiguity baked into the premise that I hope the show keeps leaning into. The northern criminal is introduced as an enemy figure, rampaging, dangerous. The Empire will use that to justify fear of the North, to reinforce stereotypes, to tighten control. But the fact that a god vaporizes him raises uncomfortable questions. Was the criminal truly just evil? Was he a pawn? Was he running from something? The show doesn't have to redeem him to make the moment unsettling. It just has to hint that the Empire's narrative is convenient. And Kale investigating it, Kale, the institutional mage, becomes this symbol of the state trying to make the divine legible. That's inherently political. Because whoever explains the miracle controls what it means. One thing I really enjoyed is how the show seems to treat information as currency. Not just magic. Not just swords. Information. Who knows what? Who admits what? Who's allowed to speak truth? When Lucien is mocked as a loser, that's a way of stripping him of informational value. People don't listen to him, so he effectively doesn't exist. And when Kale realizes Lucien is the true expert, the power shift isn't just magical, it's social. Suddenly Lucien's words matter. And the terrifying part is, the court might not be able to handle that. Because think about it. If you've spent years dismissing someone, and then you need them, what do? You either humble yourself, or you try to control them harder. And the Aurelian court doesn't strike me as the humble ourselves type. Isolde is the wildcard here because she's the person the court pretends to honor while actually controlling. So she might recognize Lucien's situation in a way Kale can't. Not because she's also mocked, though in her own way she is, reduced to a prize, but because she understands what it feels like to be valued for the wrong reasons. That's where the emotional core could ignite. I found myself watching for the small moments between Isolde and Lucien, even when the story isn't explicitly selling them as a pair yet. Because chemistry isn't just flirting. Chemistry is recognition. It's that moment when two characters clock each other's reality through all the social noise. If the show gives them scenes where they are forced to communicate in coded ways, because everyone's always watching, that could be electric. And then there's Kale's relationship to both of them. Kale might respect Isolde because she's royalty, because she's part of the Empire's structure. He might initially dismiss Lucien because Lucien disrupts that structure. And if Kale is a layered character, his arc might involve realizing that the structure he serves is more fragile, and more cruel, than he admitted. Or he could double down. Either direction is juicy, as long as the writing commits. A note on direction: the way the show frames its power reveals is not just about shock. It's about perspective. When Lucien is revealed as the true caster, it doesn't feel like the camera suddenly starts worshipping him. It feels like the camera says, "You've been looking at him wrong." That's a subtle but important difference. It's not just elevation, it's correction. And it makes the show's theme hit harder. Weakness is often a costume society forces on people, and strength is often something society refuses to recognize until it has no choice. That's not just fantasy. That's real life. And that's why this drama, with all its gods and spells and tournaments, feels weirdly personal. If you're new to this kind of story, you might be thinking, okay, so is it basically just, bullied guy is secretly OP? And yes, that's the hook. But what makes main Lemah, Kuat more interesting than the average power fantasy is that it seems genuinely curious about what being OP would do to a person who was treated like nothing. Would you become kinder? Would you become colder? Would you even care about the Empire's games? And would you owe anyone an explanation? There's a moment in the general arc, again, speaking in broad strokes, where you can feel the story tightening around Lucien as a liability. Not a hero. A liability. The court can't ignore him anymore, but acknowledging him threatens their entire worldview. Kale's investigation puts pressure on him. Isolde's tournament puts him near the center of Imperial attention whether he wants it or not. And the mysterious god aspect hangs over everything like a storm cloud, because if Lucien can access that kind of power, then the question becomes, is he the conduit, the author, or the next victim? That's the kind of question that makes me keep watching even when the plot slows down. Because it's not just, what happens next, it's, what does this mean about this world? One last craft thing I want to praise in this first stretch, the show's willingness to let discomfort sit. A lot of dramas rush to relieve tension with a joke, romance beat, triumphant win. Here, when something terrifying happens, the characters don't instantly emotionally reset. The atmosphere stays contaminated. The court smiles feel forced. The tournament's pageantry starts to feel like denial. That's mature storytelling. And it sets up what I think is the real engine of the drama, not the tournament itself, not even the divine mystery in isolation, but the collision between public narrative and private truth. The Empire has a story it tells about itself. Kale has a story he tells about magic. Lucien has a story everyone tells about him. Isolde has a story the state tells about her. The divine vaporization is the event that makes all those stories start contradicting each other in public. Which means somebody's going to have to blink first. And the more Kale digs, the more you can feel him approaching that humiliating cliff edge where the chief mage might have to admit that the person he dismissed as a nobody is standing in a category of power that Kale can't neatly classify, and the way Lucien holds himself in those investigative moments, this almost deliberate refusal to perform competence for people who never respected him, becomes its own kind of confrontation, because Lucien isn't just hiding what he can do, he's also deciding what he owes to an empire that only knows how to value people when they are useful. And when Kale presses for explanations, you can practically hear Lucien weighing whether telling the truth would save lives or simply hand the court a new chain to wrap around his neck, especially with Isolde positioned right there inside the tournament machine where every gesture gets interpreted and traded, and that's when the show starts to feel like it's about to pivot into something even more morally messy, because if Lucien really is the one who can speak the language of that mysterious Godspell, then the next question isn't just how he did it, it's who he did it for, and whether he'd do it again if the right target wasn't a rampaging criminal but someone the Empire calls honorable, someone the crowd cheers for, someone wearing Aurelian gold while the air goes suddenly terrifyingly silent and Kale realizes the rules he's been enforcing might not apply anymore if Lucien decides they don't, and Isolde has to decide what kind of future she's willing to choose when the choices were never meant to be hers in the first place, because the way her eyes track Lucien in those charged, half-watched moment suggests she's starting to see a door in the wall that nobody else even noticed was there, and that door leads straight into the heart of the Empire's biggest lie about strength and weakness, about who gets to be a hero and who gets to be erased. And the second you feel that door creak open, you start paying attention to every pause Lucien takes before he answers, every time Cale's composure stiffens like he's swallowing anger, every time Isolde's polite expression becomes just a little too still, as if she's holding herself back from saying something dangerous out loud, because the show is quietly teaching you that the real battles aren't always fought with swords in the arena but with words in a hallway, with silence in a throne room, with the choice to reveal or withhold the one truth that could unravel everything if spoken at the wrong time, while the court continues smiling like nothing has changed, even though something has, something absolutely has, and Lucien knows it in his bones, even if he refuses to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch when they call him a loser. In the same breath they start needing him to save their world from the next impossible thing that might come down from the gods, and that's the part that makes the whole loser secretly powerful hook feel less like candy and more like a loaded gun. Because if Lucien's strength is real, it's not just an upgrade for him. It's a destabilizer for everyone else. And the show is sharp enough to understand that the people with the most to lose aren't going to respond with awe, they're going to respond with strategy. There's this itch the drama keeps scratching, and it's basically the question of who gets to define reality. The Empire defines reality through ceremony, through tournaments, through public declarations. Cale defines reality through sanctioned knowledge, through what can be studied, categorized, reproduced. And then you have this divine mantra event that basically says, reality does not need your permission. That's why Cale's investigation isn't just a plotline, it's an existential insult. He's being forced into a posture he hates, uncertainty. He can't stand not knowing, not because he's curious, but because not knowing makes him small. And here's where the acting choices, when they are done right, become the difference between a decent fantasy and a genuinely tense one. The best version of Cale is not a cartoon villain. He's not constantly snarling in dark corners. He's the guy who maintains a calm face while the room shakes, because if he looks scared, the whole institution looks scared. So every little fracture matters. A jaw tightening. A stare that lingers too long on Lucien, like he's trying to calculate the man as a problem rather than a person. And when Cale speaks, you can feel how much of his identity is wrapped around being the one who doesn't get surprised. What I enjoyed about the show's tone is that it doesn't immediately reward the audience with, and then Lucien is celebrated. No. It holds you in that uncomfortable middle stage where the powerful people are still testing the boundaries of their denial. They'll do that thing where they talk about Lucien like he isn't there, even if he is there. They'll phrase their needs as orders, not requests. They'll act like recognition is something they can ration out in teaspoons, when in reality they've already tipped their hand by needing him at all. And that, for me, is where main Lemah, Kuat starts to feel like it's about class as much as it is about magic. The Empire isn't just a setting, it's a hierarchy engine. The tournament is a hierarchy engine. Even the idea of choosing a husband for Isolde, as a spectacle, is a hierarchy engine. It's a public ritual that reminds everyone who gets choices and who gets assigned. So when the show tells you Lucien has this god-adjacent power, it's also telling you he has the one thing the hierarchy can't tolerate, unassigned value. He's valuable outside the system's permission. And that's basically the scariest kind of person in any authoritarian setup, fantasy or not. If you want to know what kept me leaning forward, it wasn't just, what is the mysterious god mantra? It was, how long can the court pretend Lucien is still the joke while simultaneously trying to corner him into being their tool? Because that is such a specific human hypocrisy. People will degrade you until the moment they need you, and then they'll act offended that you remember. There's also something interesting going on with the North in this premise. We're given a criminal from the North rampages, and the Empire clearly frames the North as this threat source. But the show's choice to have that northern criminal instantly vaporized by a mysterious god spell complicates the propaganda. It's like the story is quietly whispering, you think the North is the threat? Babe, you have no idea where the real threat is coming from. And it also opens up the possibility that the North is a scapegoat. A convenient other, to keep the Empire united. That's a theme fantasy dramas love to flirt with, but but not always commit to, because it requires making your empire look bad. And main Lemah, tapi Kuat already makes the empire look bad in the way it commodifies Isolde's marriage and mocks Lucien publicly. So it's not a stretch to think the North narrative might also be part of the same ugly machine. Now, I'm going to say something that might sound picky, but I swear it matters. The way a show depicts public space tells you everything about its politics. When you have a tournament, you have a crowd. When you have a crowd, you have the possibility of public opinion as a character. And the question becomes, does the crowd feel like a living civic body, or does it feel like set dressing? In this drama, the crowd feels like a force the court is constantly managing. That's why the vaporization scene hits so hard. It's not just a cool moment of magic, it's a moment of mass witness. You can't spin something that public without effort. And I love that the story seems interested in that. In narrative control. In who tells the story of what happened. Because the moment a god erases a person in front of everyone, the empire either has to claim it as divine favor or bury it as an embarrassment. Either way, they are lying. And lying in a world with gods feels risky. That brings me to the spiritual layer. The show gives us mantra dua mysterious, and it's tempting to treat it as just fantasy flavor. But the word mantra carries a specific energy. It implies something learned, something spoken, something accessed through language. It's not just raw magical force, it's invocation. That matters, because it frames the divine as something that can be addressed. Not necessarily controlled, but contacted. And if Lucien is the one who did it, then Lucien isn't just powerful. He's literate in a divine language. That's a different kind of threat. The show is smart to make it mysterious rather than immediately explainable. Because if they explain it too early, it becomes a mechanic. And the second divine power becomes a mechanic, tension dies. You want divine power to feel like weather. Like the ocean. Something you can navigate, maybe, but not command. And if I'm being honest, there's a part of me that's always bracing for fantasy dramas to fumble gods. A lot of them either go too vague and it becomes meaningless, or they go too detailed and it becomes a lore textbook. The sweet spot is using the divine to pressure the human story, not replace it. So far, main Lemah, tapi Kuat is using that divine event like a stress test on the empire and on the character's values, which is exactly what I want. Here's a thought that kept nagging at me in the best way. What if Lucien is not chosen, in a flattering sense? What if he's collateral? What if being able to speak the god mantra isn't a sign of destiny, but a sign that something happened to him that the empire ignored because he was already the loser? That possibility makes his story darker, and honestly, richer. Because it would mean the same society that mocked him also failed to notice something terrifying happening in their backyard. And that idea ties into the show's emotional cruelty. The mocking isn't just mean, it's negligent. When you dismiss a person as worthless, you stop paying attention to what happens to them. And sometimes what happens to them is the most important thing in your world. Every few episodes, again, I'm speaking in the rhythm of the story, not pretending I have a numbered roadmap, the drama seems to pause and let you sit with how much Lucien has to swallow. Not because it's trying to wring pity out of you, but because it's building a pressure cooker. It wants you to understand that if Lucien ever snaps, it won't be random. It'll be earned. It'll be the result of 1,000 small humiliations that everybody thought didn't count. Now let's talk about Isolde again, because her storyline is the one that could easily fall into cliché if the show isn't careful. The princess with the marriage tournament can become a passive prize. But the premise already sets her up as someone whose life is being negotiated publicly, and that means she's in a constant state of performance. When you live that way, you become hyper-aware. You become skilled at reading people. So if Isolde is written well, she won't just be reactive, she'll be strategic in ways the court underestimates. And I think the show is already gesturing toward that. There's a sense that Isolde knows the tournament is not about her happiness, and she's watching who uses it as theater and who treats it as responsibility. She's watching who looks at her like a person and who looks at her like a trophy. That kind of observation is its own character arc. A really strong move the drama can make, and it feels like it wants to, is to let Isolde's soft power become actual power. Not necessarily by giving her magic, though that's possible in this kind of world, but by letting her turn the court's own rituals against them. Imagine being raised inside a cage and learning the cage's locks better than the people who built it. That's compelling. And if you put Isolde and Lucien in the same orbit, the resonance is immediate. They are both being defined by others. Lucien is the loser. Isolde is the prize. Both identities are dehumanizing. The difference is that Isolde's dehumanization is dressed up as honor, while Lucien's is dressed up as ridicule. If the show lets them recognize that shared condition, their relationship, romantic or not, could become the moral spine of the whole drama. Now, I can't say for sure where the romance lands, or if it becomes the primary engine, because we're not given that in the storyline. But what I can say is that the setup creates the potential for an intimacy that feels earned, not manufactured. Because intimacy in a court setting isn't candles and confessionals, it's stolen honesty. It's the one place you can say something real without it being weaponized. And the thing is, Cale complicates that intimacy. Cale is the kind of character who can walk into any room and change the oxygen level. If he suspects Lucien, if he needs Lucien, if he fears Lucien, that affects every scene Lucien is in. It puts a shadow over any potential connection Lucien might form with Isolde, because Cale represents the Empire's ability to punish. Which leads to another theme that I think the show is quietly obsessed with: surveillance. The tournament is surveillance disguised as celebration. The court is surveillance disguised as etiquette. Even Cale's investigation is a form of surveillance. Everyone is watching everyone. And the one person who used to be invisible, Lucien, is suddenly hypervisible. That's not a victory. That's a new kind of danger. And I love that the show doesn't pretend visibility is inherently good. A lot of underdog stories treat recognition like salvation. Here, recognition feels like exposure. It feels like the moment you step into the light, the knives come out. If you've ever had something you were good at, something you kept private because you knew the moment people found out they'd want to own it, that's the vibe. And yes, I'm projecting a little, because I've had that. Not with divine spells, obviously, unless my ability to avoid phone calls counts as supernatural. But that feeling of, if they know, they'll take, is real. And the show uses that fear as tension. Let's swing back to craft for a second, because fantasy dramas live on production value, and not just big sets. It's about coherence. Does the world feel like it exists beyond the camera frame? In main Lemah, Kuat, the Empire's spaces feel designed to make individuals look small. Tall ceilings, long corridors, symmetrical compositions. The framing often puts characters in the center of oppressive architecture, which is such a classic way to visually communicate institution, person. And then you have moments where the framing changes around Lucien, especially after his significance becomes apparent. You start to notice more close-ups. More attention to his reactions. Not in a, now he's hot and important, way, but in a, your eyes were in the wrong place, look here, way. The camera starts treating his internal world as relevant, which is a political choice in itself. Because the court doesn't treat it as relevant. The costuming also helps tell the story of who is allowed to move freely. Court clothing tends to restrict. Armor, ironically, can sometimes look freer than royal fabric, because it's designed for action. Isolde's outfits, when they are ceremonial, often read like a beautiful constraint. Lucien's more understated look reads like someone who can slip through spaces. And Cale's look reads like authority made wearable. When a show gets that right, you don't need expository dialogue to understand the hierarchy, you can see it. Editing-wise, the show seems to enjoy intercutting public spectacle with private consequence. The tournament and its noise contrasted with a quieter conversation where the real decisions happen. The crowd roaring contrasted with a silent stare that communicates threat. This is where the drama's pacing becomes a kind of manipulation, and I mean that as a compliment. It makes you feel the whiplash between what the Empire wants you to see and what's actually happening. And because I'm watching this like a drama reviewer, I'm also looking for how the show uses repetition. Not repetitive scenes, but repeated motifs. The idea of a mantra. The way the court repeats the same dismissive language about Lucien. The way Isolde is repeatedly positioned as the center of a ceremony. These repetitions are like spells of their own. The Empire is casting a social spell every time it calls Lucian a loser. It's trying to lock him into that identity. So when the real spell happens, the divine vaporization, it feels like a collision between two kinds of magic. Social magic and literal magic. And social magic is arguably the more insidious one, because it operates through agreement. It turns cruelty into common sense. It makes people laugh at someone's humiliation as if it's entertainment, the same way the tournament turns marriage politics into sport. That's why the title feels so pointed. Main Lemah, tapi Kuat. Weak hand, but strong. It implies deception, yes. But it also implies a world where strength is misread. Where strength is not necessarily visible in the ways the Empire has trained people to recognize. And that becomes a critique. A critique of how societies decide who is competent, who is worthy, who gets to speak. Now, I want to dig into Lucian's arc without inventing specifics. We know he's been mocked as a loser. We know he's actually the true expert behind the mysterious spell event. That alone sets up a huge psychological journey. Because someone who has been ridiculed for a long time often develops one of two survival strategies. They either internalize it and collapse, or they detach and observe. Lucian, by virtue of being competent, feels like the observer type. He's been watching people underestimate him, and he's been learning. The danger is that observation can turn into contempt. And contempt can turn into a desire to punish. If the show goes there, it could get genuinely morally messy in a way I would respect. Because the most boring version of this story is, bullied guy becomes hero and forgives everyone. Realistically, if you've been treated like dirt and you suddenly have godlike power, forgiveness is not the automatic first step. The first step is usually rage. Or at least temptation. And the show's premise already gives Lucian a reason to distrust the system. The Empire didn't just mock him, it created the social environment where mocking him was safe. So when Kale, representative of that system, comes investigating, Lucian has no reason to be cooperative out of goodwill. If he cooperates, it would have to be because he cares about something bigger than his own resentment. Or because he has his own agenda. That's what makes him interesting. He's not automatically virtuous just because he was wronged. The show has the opportunity to make him a complicated protagonist. Someone you root for, but also someone you fear a little. Because if his power is tied to a mysterious god, you don't know what it demands. And you don't know what it does to him. And speaking of fear, the show's use of silence is underrated. That vaporization moment, the way sound drops or tightens, sets up a language the show can return to. Every time the narrative brushes up against divine power, it can use that same sonic emptiness to make you uneasy. That's effective because it's not just visual spectacle, it's sensory disruption. There's a moment of tension that I kept expecting, and the show toys with it, the moment when someone tries to force Lucian to demonstrate his power publicly. Because that would mirror the tournament. It would turn his magic into spectacle. And the idea of that is horrifying. Because it would be the Empire trying to convert the divine event into another controllable show. Whether or not that exact scenario happens, the vibe is there. The Empire's instinct is always to put power on a stage. That's what it knows how to do. So Lucian's power is going to be treated like a performance they're entitled to watch. And Lucian, if he has any self-preservation instincts at all, is going to resist that, because public demonstrations create public expectations, and public expectations become chains. Here's a rehook that's been living in my brain. What happens when Isolde realizes the tournament is not the most dangerous performance happening in her life? What happens when she sees that Lucian is being pushed toward the same kind of public ownership she's been living under? Because that recognition could be the moment she stops thinking of the tournament as her cage alone and starts seeing the whole Empire as a cage-making machine. That's when the story becomes bigger than romance. That's when it becomes about solidarity between the controlled. Now, let me be fair and talk about where the show could lose people, because my stance on this is mixed and I want to be honest about it. Main Lemah, tapi Kuat has a bold premise, and it has this delicious tension between divine power and imperial politics. But bold premises sometimes come with uneven execution, especially in the middle stretch where a show has to turn setup into sustained momentum. If the writers lean too hard into court intrigue without giving emotional payoffs, it could start to feel like people whispering in corridors for hours. If they lean too hard into spectacle without advancing character arcs, it could start to feel like set pieces searching for a reason. The balance is fragile. And there were moments, at least in the way the story flow feels, where I could sense the drama enjoying its own atmosphere a bit too much. Like it loves the look of the court, the grandeur, the ritual. Which I get, because it's gorgeous. But atmosphere without forward motion can turn into stagnation. The show mostly avoids that by tying the atmosphere to tension, because the ritual itself is suffocating, but if you're a viewer who needs plot movement, you might feel some stretches are indulgent. That said, I'd argue the indulgence is kind of the point sometimes. The show wants you to feel how heavy the empire is. How slow it is to change. How exhausting it is to live inside a machine that converts human lives into policy. That's not always fun, but it's immersive. One surprising praise I have, and I didn't expect this, is how the show treats humiliation as violence. Some dramas play humiliation for comedy. The loser gets mocked, the audience laughs, and then later you're supposed to root for him. Here, humiliation is filmed like harm. Like something that leaves a bruise. It's not melodramatic, but it's not cute either. That's a tonal choice that earns the later seriousness of Lucien's reveal. Because if the show had treated the mocking as silly, then the reveal would feel like a comedic reversal. Instead, it feels like the world is being confronted with the consequences of its cruelty. Now, I want to zoom in on Kale again, because Kale is the character who could easily become a simple antagonist, the powerful mage threatened by the upstart. But the show can make him fascinating if it leans into his psychology. Think about what it would mean to be chief mage in an empire. You're not just a wizard, you're a political instrument. You're expected to protect the state's narrative. You're expected to be competent on command. You're expected to make the unexplainable explainable, because the public needs reassurance. So when a divine spell vaporizes someone publicly and Kale didn't see it coming, it's not just a mystery. It's a humiliation for him too. A crack in his authority. And that can make a man dangerous. Not because he's evil, but because he's cornered. That's why Kale investigating Lucien can be read in two ways simultaneously. It can be read as genuine concern for safety, and it can be read as an attempt to regain control over a power source that threatens his relevance. Both can be true. That's what makes for good drama. And if Kale has any decency, he might also have a late-blooming guilt when he realizes the person he dismissed is actually critical. But guilt doesn't automatically make people kind. Sometimes guilt makes people defensive. Sometimes it makes them double down. I wasn't wrong, I just didn't have all the data. That kind of rationalization is so human, and so infuriating, and I really hope the show leans into it. Isolde's relationship with Kale also matters. Because Kale serves the Empire, and Isolde is the Empire's symbol. Does Kale see her as a person? Or as part of the state's machinery? Does he protect her because he cares, or because she's valuable? Those distinctions shape the emotional texture of every scene they share. And the tournament, again, is such a smart crucible for those dynamics. It's a situation where Kale can claim he's neutral, is just overseeing magic safety, or investigating threats, while still influencing outcomes. It's a place where Isolde is forced to smile through discomfort. It's a place where Lucien's presence is an embarrassment until it isn't. Let's talk about how the show frames the North, because even with limited story specifics, you can feel a deliberate othering. Penjahat Dari Utara is not just criminal. It's criminal with a region attached, which in storytelling usually means the region has been coded as dangerous or inferior. That's a very old imperial move, define the borderlands as barbaric, then use that fear to justify central control. So when the North shows up as chaos, the Empire is ready to say, see. We told you. But the divine spell interrupting that chaos suggests there's a bigger narrative. It suggests the North might be connected to forces the Empire pretends aren't real. Or forces the Empire suppressed. or forces the Empire is simply too arrogant to understand. That makes me want the show to explore the North not as a monolithic evil place, but as a mirror. A place the Empire refuses to see clearly because it would reveal uncomfortable truths. And Lucien, being from wherever he's from, again, not stated, being labeled a loser within the Empire suggests he's not fully protected by status. He might be lowborn. Because you're not just watching a guy get recognized, you're watching a guy potentially get claimed. And the show does a good job, at least tonally, of making that attention feel invasive. Even when characters aren't literally staring, the atmosphere feels like eyes. Like there's nowhere to be private. That's why the few quieter moments where Lucien is alone, or Isolde is alone, or Kale is alone, hit hard. They are rare. They feel like oxygen. The drama also uses physical space to reinforce this. Courtrooms are open and exposed. Hallways are long and echoing. It's hard to hide. Meanwhile, any hint of the North, even as an idea, feels more enclosed, more harsh, more survival-driven. The Empire is a museum. The North is a furnace. And divine power is like a void. I keep coming back to that void feeling. Vaporization is not like being killed. It's like being removed. And removal is an imperial act too. Empires remove people from history all the time. They erase names. They rewrite narratives. So the divine act of removal parallels the Empire's social removal of Lucien. The Empire tries to erase him socially. The god erases someone physically. That parallel is haunting, and whether or not the show intends it explicitly, it's there in the texture. Now, I want to address a potential audience reaction I've seen with shows like this. Some viewers will want Lucien to immediately get revenge on everyone who mocked him. They want the power fantasy payoff. They want the nobles humbled, the bullies punished, the court exposed. And look, I get that urge. It's cathartic. But I actually think the more interesting path, and the one I hope the show leans into, is not revenge, but choice. What does Lucien do with power when revenge is available? Does he become the thing he hates? Does he try to dismantle the system? Does he try to protect Isolde, not because she's a princess, but because she's also trapped? The show's title tempts you into thinking it's going to be straightforward catharsis. But the premise's moral ambiguity suggests something more complex. And complexity is where rewatch value lives. Complexity is where performances get to shine. Speaking of performances, one thing that stands out is how much of the emotional story is carried by restraint. This is not a melodrama where everyone is constantly crying and yelling. It's a court drama. People don't get to have big emotions publicly. So you get these tiny tells. A hand that hesitates. A glance that's held too long. A voice that goes slightly colder. And when the show finally lets someone break, when someone's mask slips, it feels like a big event. That kind of acting is hard. It's easy to do, big. It's hard to do, controlled, without becoming flat. The cast, from what the story requires, seems built for that. And the direction supports them by giving faces time. It doesn't cut away too quickly. It trusts the audience to read micro-expression. Now, a lightly humorous aside because my brain needs it, there is nothing more stressful than watching a character keep a huge secret in a palace full of bored nobles. Like, you can have the most powerful spell in the world, but can it protect you from Lady Nosy enough to weaponize a sigh? The court's real magic is gossip. And that's not even a joke. Gossip in this show is basically a secondary soundtrack. Even when you don't hear literal whispers, you feel them. The editing sometimes cuts to little clusters of nobles reacting, and you can almost see rumors forming like storm clouds. That adds pressure to Isolde and Lucien in particular, because their reputations are not just personal, they are political assets. Which brings up another theme, reputation as currency. Lucien has been assigned a worthless reputation, which is why people feel safe mocking him. Isolde has been assigned a priceless reputation, which is why people feel entitled to control her. Kale's reputation is competence, which is why he can't afford uncertainty. The vaporization event threatens everyone's currency. It introduces a new kind of power that can't be bought with reputation. And it also introduces fear, which is a currency empires use when respect fails. If the empire can't maintain control through admiration and tradition, it will use fear. The North Criminal story is already a fear tool. The divine event could become another fear tool if the court spins it correctly. That's why Cale's investigation is urgent. Whoever explains the divine act first controls how fear is directed. So if Lucien is the true expert, the Empire needs to either co-opt him into their narrative or silence him. And that's where the drama's tension becomes almost claustrophobic, because there's no safe outcome. If Lucien helps them, he becomes their property. If he refuses, he becomes their enemy. If he runs, he becomes proof of guilt. If he stays, he becomes vulnerable. Isolde, similarly, has no safe choice. If she plays along with the tournament, she's complicit in her own commodification. If she refuses, she becomes a political crisis. If she chooses someone unexpected, she destabilizes alliances. If she chooses someone safe, she sacrifices herself. The show sets up that her eventual decision, whatever it is, will be a turning point not just for romance but for the Empire's stability. And Cale's no safe choice either. If he admits ignorance, he loses authority. If he lies, he risks being exposed. If he pushes Lucien too hard, he might provoke a force he can't contain. If he doesn't push, he fails his role. Everybody is trapped. That's good drama. Here's the point where I want to talk about what the show is really about, beneath plot mechanics. To me, main Lemah, Kuat is about systems that confuse appearance with truth. It's about how societies build rituals to avoid confronting their own fragility. It's about how the marginalized can hold the keys to survival, not because they're inherently special, but because they were forced to adapt in ways the privileged never had to. And there's a particularly biting subtext about entertainment. The tournament is entertainment. Isolde's life is entertainment. Lucien's humiliation is entertainment. The crowd consumes all of it. The Empire uses it to maintain cohesion. And then a divine act turns real violence into spectacle for a second, and everyone has to sit with the fact that their entertainment is built on blood, even if that blood is hidden behind ceremony. Or simply socially powerless. That makes him closer, in terms of power position, to the outsider narrative the Empire attaches to the North. Which means the Empire's categories are already cracking. Here's the thing, fantasy stories about empires are almost always really stories about the present. About who gets to belong. About who gets to be safe. About who gets to define morality. Main Lemah, Kuat is playing with those ideas through a glossy tournament surface, but underneath it is a pretty sharp critique of how societies treat people they consider disposable. And because I'm watching it as a viewer, not just analyzing, I want to talk about what it feels like. It feels tense in a slow burn way. It feels like the air is always slightly too tight. Even in scenes that should be celebratory, there's an undertone of dread. Like everyone is smiling because they are supposed to, not because they are happy. And then when something truly frightening happens, the celebration doesn't stop because the Empire can't afford for it to stop. It needs continuity. It needs the performance to continue. That's chilling. That's also why the show's strongest moments are often not the big magical visuals, but the quiet social moments after. The way people pretend nothing happened. The way they reassert control through language. The way they try to turn fear into protocol. You can feel the machine working. If the show has a weakness, it's that sometimes it risks making its central mystery too abstract. Mysterious God mantra can be a great hook, but it can also become a fog if the narrative keeps pushing answers away without giving satisfying intermediate revelations. Viewers need stepping stones. They need the sense that the investigation is moving, that character relationships are changing, that knowledge is accumulating. Mystery is only fun when it feels like progress, even if the biggest answer is saved for later. Where the drama compensates for that is by making the mystery emotionally relevant. It's not just, who cast the spell. It's, why is the person who cast it treated like nothing? That's a character mystery as much as a plot mystery. And character mysteries can sustain you longer than lore mysteries, because they are rooted in human emotion. And the drama gives you a lot to chew on there. Every time Lucien is mocked, you're learning how the world works. Every time Kale pushes, you're learning how the institution responds to threat. Every time Isolde is forced into public performance, you're learning how power is maintained. There's also a really interesting moral question embedded in the vaporization itself. The northern criminal was rampaging, yes. But vaporization is extreme. It's not restraint. It's not capture. It's deletion. And the show doesn't present it as a clean heroic act, it presents it as unsettling. That's important, because it keeps the divine power morally ambiguous. It doesn't let you relax into, oh good, the gods are on our side. It makes you wonder what our side even means. And that matters for Lucien. Because if Lucien can do that, then Lucien is capable of irreversible violence. Even if he used it in a context the Empire can justify, the capacity is there. That means the story can't just treat him as a cinnamon roll underdog. It has to treat him as someone who could become dangerous, even if he's sympathetic. That's a grown-up choice, and it's where the show can either become generic or become great. I also want to give credit to how the show handles the concept of weakness. Lucien is called weak socially, but the title suggests strength. Isolde might be considered weak because she's constrained, but she might have inner strength. Kale might appear strong because he has authority, but his strength might be brittle if it depends on being right. The Empire might appear strong, but a single divine intervention reveals its fragility. Weakness and strength are being flipped and reframed constantly. And that's why the show's pacing choices make sense thematically. The slow investigative scenes mirror the slow grinding machinery of the Empire. The sudden divine vaporization mirrors how quickly that machinery can be rendered irrelevant. The tournament's repetitive structure mirrors how traditions repeat until they are interrupted. One more personal confession, since I'm already being honest, I'm the kind of viewer who gets irrationally angry at characters who bully someone for being useless, when they've never actually checked if that person is useless. It hits some nerve in me about how people decide competence based on charisma or status. So watching the court treat Lucien like a joke was genuinely hard sometimes. Not in a, this show is bad, way, but in a, wow, this is too real, way. And when the reveal shifts the power dynamic, it's satisfying, but it doesn't erase the discomfort. It lingers. Which is exactly what it should do. Because the point isn't just to cheer when the loser becomes strong. The point is to reflect on why we were okay with him being mocked in the first place. The show invites that reflection, and I respect it. Now, let's linger on the idea of choice, because Isolde's tournament storyline is basically a giant metaphor for constrained choice. She's choosing a husband, but within options curated by political need. Lucien is choosing to reveal or hide his power, but within a world that punishes him for being seen. Kale is choosing to investigate, but within an institution that demands answers. Even the northern criminal, rampaging, might have been acting out of desperation rather than pure malice. Everyone's choices are pressured by systems. And when you bring gods into that, it complicates agency even further. If there are divine forces that can erase people, then human choice starts to look tiny. Which is why it's important that the show still centers human decisions. The divine is the storm, but the characters are the ones deciding whether to build shelters, blame outsiders, or burn the house down. Here's a curiosity pivot that I couldn't shake: if Lucien can speak the god mantra, does that make him closer to the gods, or does it make him their weapon? Because those are very different fates. Being chosen sounds romantic until you realize it can mean being used. That question colors every scene where Lucien is forced into attention. That's why the vaporization scene lands as horror. It's the moment the show says, you thought this was a game. And it's also the moment you start to question the ethics of watching. Which is a wild thing for a drama to make you feel while you're literally watching it. But it works because it's woven into the narrative. It's not preachy. It's just there. Uncomfortable. Now, because my stance is mixed, I want to point out something I think the show could improve in terms of clarity, without demanding it spoon-feed. Sometimes, when a story leans heavily on atmosphere and implication, it risks leaving character motivations too opaque. Lucien's secrecy is understandable, but if the show holds him too far away emotionally for too long, some viewers might detach. Isolde's restraint is realistic, but if she's always composed, some viewers might interpret her as passive. Cale's control is compelling, but if he's always calculating, he might feel cold. The solution isn't to make them explain themselves. The solution is to give them moments of private truth. Moments where we see what the mask costs. And the drama does sprinkle those moments, but it has to keep doing it consistently if it wants the audience to stay emotionally invested, not just intellectually intrigued. Because the plot hook can carry you for a while. The divine mystery can carry you for a while. But long-form drama lives on emotion. It lives on relationships shifting in ways you can feel, not just understand. And the relationships here are set up to shift dramatically. Lucien and Cale are on a collision course, not just because of power, but because of worldview. Isolde and the court are on a collision course, because she's not a statue, she's a person. Isolde and Lucien are on a collision course in the sense that their lives are being dragged into the same spotlight, and either they become allies or they become each other's leverage. That last possibility is the one that makes me nervous in a good way. Because the Empire could easily try to use Isolde to control Lucien. Or use Lucien to control Isolde. And if either of them has to decide between personal freedom and someone else's safety, that's where the drama can get heartbreaking. I'm going to paint an impressionistic moment that the show's setup makes almost inevitable, and I'm doing this carefully so I don't invent a specific scene that doesn't exist. Imagine a quiet corridor. The sound of the tournament far away like a distant ocean. Torches or lanterns or whatever the Empire uses casting that warm gold light that makes everything look romantic even when it isn't. Lucien pressed against a wall metaphorically, not physically, by the weight of what people want from him. Isolde passing by with her court mask on, but her eyes tired. They don't need to say much. Maybe they don't say anything. Maybe it's just a look. That look that says, you feel it too, don't you? That's the kind of moment this drama is built for, because the true intimacy here is shared recognition of captivity. And then, because this is a political world, that moment would matter. Someone would see. Or Cale would sense. Or the court would interpret. And suddenly a human connection becomes a political liability. That's the tragedy of empires, they turn love into leverage. The show's title is playful on the surface, but the story underneath is not that playful. It's tense. It's heavy. It's about who gets to be human in a system that prefers symbols. Another rehook that kept me watching, what does the mysterious God want? Because divine intervention, narratively, is rarely random. Even if the characters don't know the motive, the story is telling us there is a motive. The God vaporized a northern criminal in public. That act could be read as protection of the Empire, or as punishment, or as a message, or as bait. And if Lucien is the true caster, then either he shares the God's motive or he's being used as a mouthpiece. Both are terrifying. And Cale, of course, is going to want to reduce that terror to a report. To a controllable explanation. That's what institutions do, they shrink the unknown until it fits on paper. But divine power does not fit on paper. It fits in fear. It fits in myth. It fits in obedience. So Cale's investigation is also an attempt to prevent myth from spreading uncontrollably. Because myth is dangerous to empires. Myths create alternative loyalties. If people start believing a god intervened, they might start asking why. They might start questioning the empire's legitimacy. They might start seeing the tournament as trivial. They might start seeing the court as powerless. And that is not acceptable. This is where the show's writing has an opportunity to be genuinely sharp about propaganda. The tournament is propaganda. It says, look how civilized we are. Look how orderly. Look how we can decide the princess's future through honorable competition. The divine event says, your order is a costume. So the empire has to respond with propaganda of its own. Either claiming divine favor or reframing it as a contained incident. And Lucien, the unexpected source, becomes a propaganda problem. I'm fascinated by the possibility that the court's first instinct isn't to kill Lucien, but to brand him. To assign him a story that makes him useful. Maybe they try to present him as a loyal servant of the Empire, even if he isn't. Maybe they try to hide his role entirely and let Kale take credit. That kind of narrative theft is very real in hierarchical systems. And it would fit the theme, the powerful stealing the marginalized person's value while continuing to disrespect them. If the show goes there, it becomes not just a fantasy drama but a story about authorship. About who gets to tell your story. Lucien has been living under a story told by others, loser, weak, irrelevant. Now that his truth is dangerous, the Empire will want to tell a new story for him. And his arc becomes a fight for self-definition. Isolde's arc is similar. Her story is, princess, symbol, prize. The tournament is the Empire telling her story publicly. Her fight, if she chooses to fight, would be to reclaim authorship. And Kale, ironically, might also be fighting for authorship, because the divine event threatens his role as the narrator of magic. He wants to be the one who explains, the one who names. Lucien, being the true expert, steals that from him. So you have three characters. All in different ways fighting over story control. That's such a rich foundation. Now, I want to briefly touch on how the show might handle action and spectacle moving forward, because the vaporization is such a strong early flex that it risks making everything else feel smaller. How do you top a god erased a man in public? You don't, not by scaling up explosions. You top it by scaling up consequence. By making the ripple effects more intense than the initial splash. The drama seems aware of that. It makes the vaporization a beginning, not a climax. It uses it to rearrange relationships. That's the correct move. And if the show continues that approach, the most memorable, big moment might not be magical at all. They might be political betrayals. They might be quiet choices. They might be the moment Isolde stops playing along. They might be the moment Lucien refuses an order. They might be the moment Kale chooses control over truth, or truth over control. Those are the moments that create lasting impact. Not just pretty spells. And yes, I do want pretty spells too. I'm not made of stone. But pretty spells without human stakes are just screensavers. Let's talk about Lucien's strength again, because the title can mislead you into thinking it's purely physical or magical. But strength in this story also seems to be about endurance. About being able to live under contempt without letting it hollow you out. And that kind of strength is not glamorous. It's quiet. It's stubborn. It's sometimes ugly. The drama has a chance to show that strength isn't always noble. Sometimes strength is spite. Sometimes strength is refusal. Sometimes strength is learning how to survive in a room that wants you to shrink. If Lucien's strength is built from being treated as nothing, it might come with sharp edges. And I want the show to honor that, not sand it down into a generic hero arc. Because here's the truth, the moment someone who's been powerless gains power, the world suddenly cares about their morality. Will you be responsible? Will you be kind? Will you be the bigger person? And it's like, where was that moral concern when they were being crushed? The drama can interrogate that hypocrisy, and I hope it does. Isolde, similarly, might be expected to be gracious. To accept her role. To smile. To be the good princess. And the moment she resists, she'll be called selfish, ungrateful, destabilizing. That's also a hypocrisy the show can expose. Kale will be expected to be competent. To have answers. To protect the Empire. And if he fails, he'll be blamed, even if the problem is beyond him. Institutions love scapegoats too. So everyone is trapped in expectations. The show is about what happens when those expectations break. Now, a word on dialogue. Court dramas often live on dialogue that has two meanings, the polite meaning and the real meaning. Main Lemah, Kuat seems to enjoy that. People say one thing while implying another. Compliments become threats. Questions become accusations. And Lucian's presence adds a third layer, because people who dismiss him might speak carelessly around him, assuming he doesn't matter. That gives him access to information, and information is power. If the show is smart, it will keep using that dynamic. Lucian as the person people underestimate, therefore the person who hears everything. Isolde as the person people perform for, therefore the person who sees through performance. Kale as the person people fear, therefore the person people lie to. That triangle is fertile. And it also creates opportunities for really intense scenes that don't require action. Imagine Kale questioning Lucian in a way that seems respectful on the surface but is actually coercive. Imagine Isolde present, watching, unable to intervene openly because of politics. Imagine Lucian choosing his words carefully, not because he's afraid of Kale personally, but because he's afraid of what the Empire will do with the truth. That's tension. The show's editing style supports that kind of tension when it lets silences stretch. When it cuts to hands. When it shows the way someone's posture changes. That's where the on-camera voice, in my head, as I watched, was basically me whispering, "Oh, this is getting bad." Not because someone drew a sword, but because someone chose a word. Here's a little contrarian moment inside my mixed stance. I actually don't mind when the show gets a bit talky, as long as the talk is dangerous. A lot of people equate action with excitement and dialogue with boredom. But in a court setting, dialogue is action. It's where alliances are made. It's where threats are delivered safely. It's where people die socially before they die physically. So when the show leans into conversation, I'm okay with it, because it fits the world. My frustration only kicks in if the dialogue starts circling the same point without evolution. If characters keep saying, "We must protect the Empire," without anyone challenging what that means. If Kale keeps investigating, without us seeing his thinking change. If Lucian keeps being mocked in the same way without the social dynamic shifting. Repetition is powerful when it escalates. It's dead when it loops. So far, the premise suggests escalation, because Lucian's reveal changes the room. You can't keep mocking him the same way when you need him. You might still mock him, but the mocking becomes nervous. It becomes a defense mechanism. That subtle shift is where good writing lives. And Isolde, watching all of this, has to decide whether she plays the court game or breaks it. She's the one with the most visible stake, because her husband's selection is literally being staged. But Lucian's power introduces a second game running underneath the tournament. The game of who controls the divine narrative. And Isolde is positioned perfectly to see both games at once, because she's the centerpiece of the public one and a potential key in the private one. That's why I keep saying she can't be passive if the story is honest. The world is too political for her to be passive. Even survival would require strategy. Passivity would be suicide in this environment. And then, the northern element hangs over everything like a threat of expansion. We've only seen a criminal from the north in the setup, but that's enough to hint that the Empire's border tensions are going to matter. Because if there are forces outside the Empire's control, whether political, cultural, or divine, the tournament starts to look like a distraction. A shiny ritual to keep the public busy while the real danger approaches. Which is such a classic imperial failure mode, by the way. Distract the populace with spectacle while ignoring structural cracks. It's timeless. And depressing. And great drama fodder. If the show continues to tie the tournament to that broader tension, it will feel cohesive. The tournament won't just be a romance gimmick, it will be a symptom of an empire that prioritizes optics over reality. And Lucian's divine caster reveal will be the reality punching through the optics. Here's another rehook line that kept me hungry. When the Empire finally tries to solve Lucian, is Lucian going to let them? Because there's a version of this story where Lucian is quietly noble, cooperates, saves everyone, and earns respect. And there's a version where Lucian refuses to be domesticated. Where his strength is not just power, but autonomy. Where he makes choices that are inconvenient for the Empire, maybe even morally grey, because he refuses to be owned. That second version is riskier. It might make some viewers uncomfortable. But it would make the drama memorable. And Kale, in that version, becomes even more fascinating, because he would be forced to confront the fact that his authority is not the same as rightness. He would be forced to negotiate with someone he can't command. That's a humiliation for an institutional man. And humiliations, as we've established, are central to this show. Now, I want to talk a bit about how the show uses mysterious God as a narrative presence. Even when the God isn't on screen, the fear of it is. The characters act differently after the vaporization. The crowd's confidence is dented. The court's rituals are slightly more frantic. Cale's urgency increases. Lucien's caution becomes more loaded. That's good writing. The event changes behavior. And it also introduces a fascinating possibility, that the God is not aligned with the Empire's moral framework. The Empire might assume gods support order, hierarchy, tradition. But the God's act was chaotic, disruptive, absolute. That doesn't feel like the Empire's values. It feels like a different kind of justice, or a different kind of agenda. If the show explores that, it could become a story about the danger of assuming divine approval means moral approval. Empires love to claim that gods support them. But gods, in mythology, are rarely that simple. They can be petty, indifferent, or brutal. They can punish hubris. And what is an empire if not organized hubris? Cale, as chief mage, might have his own beliefs about gods. He might treat them as sources of power, as phenomena, as forces to be studied. Lucien might treat them differently. Isolde might have been raised with state-approved religion. The collision of those beliefs could create some really compelling ideological conflict. And again, none of that requires the show to dump lore. It just requires it to let characters interpret the divine differently, and to let those interpretations shape choices. Now, because we're on Bongo Gaming and I know some of you watching are Critic's Brain viewers, let's get into structural craft a little more. The premise sets up 3 engines: the tournament engine, the investigation engine, and the divine mystery engine. The challenge for the writers is to braid those engines so none of them feels like a side quest. The tournament provides public stakes and a ticking clock. The investigation provides suspense and knowledge accumulation. The divine mystery provides existential threat. Lucien is the bridge between investigation and divine mystery. Isolde is the bridge between tournament and politics. Cale is the bridge between politics and investigation. If the show keeps those bridges active, keeps characters crossing into each other's arenas, then the structure will feel tight. If it doesn't, you risk siloing. You risk having Isolde tournament scenes separate from Cale investigation scenes, separate from Lucien mysterious scenes, and the drama starts to feel episodic rather than cohesive. So the most satisfying moments are when these threads collide. When the tournament spectacle is disrupted by investigation. When Isolde's public role collides with Lucien's private danger. When Cale's institutional mission collides with divine uncertainty. The vaporization event is the first major collision. Lucien's reveal is the second. The story needs a third, a fourth, a fifth. Not necessarily bigger in spectacle, but bigger in consequence. And that's where I think the show's middle stretch, if it has one, will live or die. It needs to keep shifting the power dynamics. It needs to keep making the court's responses evolve. It needs to keep giving Isolde agency in meaningful ways, not just reaction shots. It needs to keep making Lucien's secret feel like it costs something, not just a cool trait. One of the most emotionally potent costs the show can explore is isolation. If Lucien can't trust anyone, strength becomes lonely. If Isolde can't speak freely, royalty becomes lonely. If Cale can't admit uncertainty, authority becomes lonely. Loneliness is a quiet theme here. And loneliness, ironically, is what can make characters reach toward each other in a court that forbids true connection. That's why even small moments of genuine conversation could land like bombs. Not because they are romantic, but because they are rare. Let me also touch on humor, because the show is not a comedy, but it does have room for a certain kind of dry irony. The irony of an empire staging a husband tournament while divine forces vaporize people. The irony of Cale, the chief mage, being outmatched by a loser. The irony of public spectacle being the empire's preferred tool, while the most important power in the story operates through a whispered mantra. The show doesn't need to wink at you for this to be funny. It's funny in the way reality is funny sometimes, when people are so committed to a system that they keep performing it even as it burns. That's dark comedy. And if the show leans into that lightly, without undercutting the stakes, it can make the drama sharper. Now, I want to zoom back out and talk about why the premise resonates beyond fantasy. Because a lot of us have lived in systems that reward the loud and punish the quiet. That treat confidence as competence. That assume that loser is a loser because of some inherent truth, not because of social bias. This drama takes that everyday cruelty and gives it a fantasy amplification. What if the person you mocked could erase reality with a word? That's satisfying, yes. But it's also a mirror. It forces you to confront why you enjoyed the mocking early on, if you did. And it forces you to confront what you think justice looks like when the powerless become powerful. And because the show introduces divine power rather than just, he trained in secret, it also asks a theological question: does power come from effort, or from grace, or from trauma, or from accident? And does the origin of power change how we judge the person who has it? If Lucien's power is divine, people might treat it as destiny. If it's learned, they might treat it as theft. If it's trauma-induced, they might treat it as contamination. The origin matters socially, not just mechanically. Kale, as the institutional mage, likely believes power should come through sanctioned channels. Through study, approval, maybe lineage. Lucien being powerful outside those channels is, to Kale, illegitimate. That's a political conflict disguised as a magical one. And I love when fantasy does that. When magic is politics. Isolde's marriage tournament is also politics disguised as romance. It's the same concept, a personal thing turned into state machinery. So the show has parallel structures. Kale's magic institution. Isolde's marriage institution. Both are ways the Empire tries to control the unpredictable. And then the gods, and Lucien, represent the unpredictable. Here's where the show's title becomes almost sarcastic. Main Lemah, Kuat. The Empire thinks it has strong hands. It thinks it can move pieces. It thinks it can pick Isolde's future through a tournament. It thinks Kale can solve mysteries. But the real strong hand might be the one everyone dismissed. Or the one nobody can see at all, the gods. So the show is playing with who is actually holding the board. Now, I'm going to talk about one more potential weakness that might bother some viewers: tonal whiplash. You start with tournament spectacle, then shift into horror-like divine erasure, then into investigative intrigue, then into social humiliation drama. That's a lot of flavors. If the direction isn't confident, that can feel messy. But when it works, it feels like life. Life is messy. Politics, romance, violence, and spirituality often collide. The question is whether the show has a strong enough emotional through line to unify those tones. For me, the through line is humiliation and control. The tournament is controlled humiliation for contenders and for Isolde. The court's mocking of Lucien is humiliation. Kale's fear of not knowing is a fear of humiliation. The divine vaporization humiliates the Empire itself, because it reveals their lack of control. So every tone shift is actually another angle on the same theme. That's why it holds together. And as the story moves forward, the tension is going to come from who responds to humiliation with cruelty, and who responds with change. Because humiliation can make you compassionate, if you recognize it in others. Or it can make you vicious, if you decide to ensure you're never the one being laughed at again. Kale could go either way. Lucien could go either way. Isolde could go either way. That's the character drama. If I'm hoping for anything, it's that the show doesn't rush to make Lucien a clean hero. Let him be angry. Let him be cautious. Let him make choices that are not purely noble. Let Isolde be strategic, even ruthless if needed. Let Kale be sympathetic in some moments and terrifying in others. Let the Empire be seductive in its beauty and rotten in its ethics. That's the kind of fantasy drama that sticks with you. Because the truth is, the premise is already compelling. The question is whether the drama has the courage to complicate its own catharsis. And you can feel that courage in the way the story positions Lucien's reveal not as a victory lap, but as a new trap. The moment he's identified as the true expert, the story doesn't relax. It tightens. It starts asking, okay, now that the court knows, what will they do to him? What will they demand? What will they threaten? And how will Lucien respond when the people who mocked him suddenly want to call him asset instead of loser? Because that's not respect, that's just a different kind of objectification. And if Isolde recognizes that shift in language, if she hears the way they start talking about Lucien the way they talk about her, like a piece on the board, then her entire relationship to the tournament could change in an instant, because she might realize the Empire doesn't just commodify princesses, it commodifies anything valuable, even miracles, even divine language, and that realization could be the spark that turns her from a symbol into a disruptor, especially if Cale, with all his polished authority, starts treating Lucien's power as something to be contained, for the good of the realm, because that phrase, for the good of the realm, is always where empathy goes to die when institutions get scared, and Lucien can hear it. He can hear the chain being forged in real time, and the question becomes whether he breaks it quietly, strategically, or explosively, because every option has a cost, and the show is at its best when it makes you feel those costs before anyone even makes a move. When the tension is so thick in a supposedly elegant hall that you can practically taste metal in the air and you realize the next real confrontation might not be a duel in the arena but a moment where Lucien simply says no and the entire Empire has to decide whether to accept that no or crush him for daring to speak it, and Isolde, watching, has to decide whether she stays safely silent in her gilded role or risks everything by aligning herself with the one person in the court who understands what it's like to be laughed at while being dangerously, inconveniently essential, and Cale, caught between fear and pride, has to decide whether the truth matters more than control when the gods themselves have already shown they don't care about the Empire's rules. And that's exactly where the drama starts to feel like it's building toward a turning point that isn't about winning the tournament at all but about rewriting who gets to hold power in a world where the strongest hand might belong to the person everyone trained themselves not to see, and the moment they finally look directly at him they might realize they've been standing at the edge of something they can't step back from because Lucien isn't just a man with a spell, he's a question the Empire can't answer without admitting what it is, And that's the scariest kind of mirror, because the court can deal with monsters. They have scripts for monsters. They have prisons, armies, sermons, propaganda. What they don't have a script for is the possibility that the monster label was just convenience, and the real threat is their own reflex to erase anyone they can't categorize. That's why I keep coming back to how the show frames Lucien in group scenes. Even after the premise level reveal, he's still often shot like he's on the edge of the frame, like the world is trying to keep him peripheral. It's subtle, but it reinforces the idea that visibility is contested territory here. And when the camera finally does give him center weight, it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like exposure. Like stepping into a spotlight that can burn. Isolde's side of that mirror is brutal too, because she's been visible her whole life and still not seen. The tournament is basically the Empire saying, look at her, while refusing to ask, who is she? So when you place Isolde and Lucien in the same narrative pressure cooker, you get this really interesting inversion, the invisible man with real power, and the visible woman with constrained power. If the drama is at all serious about its themes, it won't just use that as aesthetic contrast, it'll force both of them to confront what power costs when it's public property. And Cale, hovering over it all, is the person most likely to insist that everything must have a place. That impulse can read as protective, until you realize, a place often means a cage. The show keeps teasing this line Cale might cross where investigation becomes containment, where curiosity becomes policing, and the tension isn't whether he's smart enough to figure Lucien out, it's whether he's willing to accept an answer that makes him feel small, because the moment he can't dominate the narrative anymore is the moment he has to either change or break. And the way the court leans in when he speaks suggests they are desperate for him to choose control, which makes me wonder. What happens when Lucien realizes the only leverage he truly has isn't his spell at all, but his refusal to play along, because sometimes the strongest move in a rigged game is simply not to move when everyone demands you do, and that's where this story starts to get dangerously interesting if it commits to the idea that strength can look like stillness right up until it looks like a storm, And Isolde can feel that storm coming even if she can't name it yet, because the air around Lucien isn't just tense, it's waiting, like the pressure shift right before a thunderstorm breaks. You know that weird moment where the sky hasn't done anything yet, but your body can tell something's about to change. That's the atmosphere the show builds around him once Cale's attention locks in and the court's laughter starts to sound a little more forced. Because ridicule is easy when you feel safe. Ridicule gets shaky when the target stops needing you. And the drama is very intentional about making that safety feel fake. The Aurelian Empire is presented as this polished machine, but it's a machine that runs on performance. It runs on people pretending the rules are natural. The tournament is supposed to be a celebration, but it's also a public lesson. This is who we honor, this is who we discard, this is how we choose a future for our princess, this is how we tell ourselves we're civilized. Then one divine phrase turns a living person into nothing, and suddenly the lesson becomes unstable. It's like the blackboard got erased mid-sentence. Cale's role in that instability is where the show gets deliciously tense. Because he's not just chasing a culprit, he's trying to reassert a world view. He needs the divine to be legible. He needs it to be something a chief mage can contain inside the Empire's logic. And when that logic leads him to Lucien, someone the Empire has already agreed is insignificant, it's not just a surprise, it's an insult to the entire hierarchy. That's why Cale can't simply accept Lucien. Acceptance would mean admitting the hierarchy is a lie. Which is a perfect setup for the kind of conflict that doesn't resolve with a single confrontation. It's slow-burn ideological warfare. Cale will keep trying to translate Lucien into a category he understands. Lucien will keep resisting being translated at all. And Isolde is sitting inside the most visible cage in the Empire, realizing that categories are how the Empire kills you without drawing a sword. There's a moment, conceptually, that the show keeps circling, the instant when politeness turns into coercion. Court dramas live in that microshift. Someone smiles, offers a request, but the request is attached to consequences. And the genius of having a tournament as the frame is that coercion is normal there. Everyone is choosing to compete, but social pressure makes refusal costly. Isolde is choosing a husband, but refusal would be treason adjacent. Lucien is asked to explain, but the ask has teeth. So when the show tightens around him, you can feel that the next step isn't going to be a polite question. It's going to be a demand dressed as concern. Here's the hook that keeps twisting the knife for me. What does Lucien do if the Empire tries to make his power part of the tournament spectacle? Because that would be the Empire's instinct. Turn it into pageantry. Make it look controlled. If the public is afraid, give them a performance where the Empire appears to command the divine. That's propaganda gold. And Lucien, being the one person who can actually touch that force, becomes the perfect centerpiece for a lie. And I'm not saying that definitely happens. I'm saying the story's pressure points are aligned for something like that. Because it's the natural collision of these three threads, the tournament's hunger for spectacle, the court's hunger for control, and the divine mystery's refusal to behave. When a show is operating on that level, the little craft choices start to matter more. Like lighting. The court scenes tend to bathe everything in warm, flattering gold, which makes the Empire look benevolent even when it's being cruel. It's a visual lie that matches the narrative lie. Then anything tied to the divine feels colder, emptier, more stripped. Even if the set is still ornate, the mood drains. The show doesn't need to literally change locations to change temperature, it changes the emotional weather through color and sound. Sound is a big one. The tournament has crowd noise, fanfare energy, this communal roar that makes you feel like you're watching history as entertainment. The investigation scenes pull that away. They isolate voices. Footsteps echo. Silence stretches. It's like the show is taking you from public intoxication to private hangover. And that hangover is where the truth lives. Another rehook, because this is where I started really leaning in. What if Isolde is the first one to actually speak to Lucien like a human being after the reveal? Not like an asset, not like a threat, not like a rumor. Just a person. In a court where everyone talks in transactions, that kind of plain recognition would be radical. And it would also be dangerous, because the court would read it as alliance, and alliance is political. This is also where I want to be honest about my mixed stance again. I admire what the show is doing. I like its themes, its tension, its craft. But there's a thin line between slow burn tension and narrative stalling. If the show spends too long in that everyone circles Lucien, nobody makes a move space, it risks turning the tension into frustration. The payoff has to come, not necessarily in explosions, but in decisions. Someone has to choose something irreversible. A refusal. A betrayal. A public statement. A private deal. Something that changes the board. Because the premise gives us a fantastic board. But the pieces need to move. Lucien, as a character, is the key to whether those movements feel satisfying. If he's written as endlessly reactive, just dodging, just hiding, the show could start to feel like it's withholding. But if he's written as quietly proactive, choosing when to reveal, choosing what to withhold, choosing who to trust, choosing where to stand, then the same slow pacing becomes suspense. It becomes strategy. And that's where I'll give the show credit. The very fact that Lucien has survived as the court's punching bag suggests he's been strategizing for a long time. People don't survive that kind of environment without learning its patterns. Even if he looks passive, it's likely a chosen posture. And the drama seems aware of that, because it frames his restraint not as helplessness but as calculation. The power fantasy here isn't, he can vaporize someone. It's, he can endure the room without letting the room own him. Isolde's endurance, similarly, is its own strength. The tournament forces her to be watched constantly. She's not allowed messy emotions in public. So when the show gives her even a flicker of impatience, even a micro-expression of disgust, it lands hard. It feels like rebellion in a world where rebellion is punished not just with violence but with narrative assassination. They won't say, she's sad. They'll say, she's unstable. They'll say, she's unfit. They'll say, she's influenced. Because that's how courts destroy women who refuse to smile. Cale's endurance is different. It's endurance of responsibility, of expectation. He's the Empire's magician. If he fails, the Empire is embarrassed. And embarrassment in a court is never just emotional, it's political vulnerability. So Cale's fear isn't just personal. It's professional. It's institutional. And that's why his interest in Lucien can never be purely curious. It's defensive. It's the immune system reacting to an unknown organism. The show's subtext about institutions as living things is strong. Institutions protect themselves. They absorb threats. They co-opt outsiders. And when they can't co-opt, they expel. Lucien is a threat the institution wants to either digest or vomit out. Isolde is a resource the institution wants to display. Cale is the institution's antibody, except sometimes antibodies attack the body too, if you know what I mean. If the drama leans into that metaphor, it can get genuinely tragic. Because it might force characters to choose between personal decency and institutional loyalty, and those choices are rarely clean. Cale might do something awful, for the realm. Isolde might do something ruthless, for peace. Lucien might do something morally great, for survival. And if the show lets those actions have consequences, not just plot consequences but emotional ones, it will feel weighty in the best way. Let me bring up editing again, because I noticed how the show uses reaction shots to implicate the audience. When Lucien is mocked, the camera doesn't just show him suffering, it often shows other people watching and doing nothing. That's important. It widens guilt. It says this isn't just one bully, it's a culture. And it made me squirm, because it forces you to ask, if I were in that crowd, would I laugh? Would I look away? Would I intervene? Most of us like to imagine we'd intervene. Most of us probably wouldn't, unless we had power. And that's the whole point. So when Lucien turns out to have power, the show forces a second question: do you only care when the victim can bite back? That's the kind of question that makes a fantasy drama feel uncomfortably relevant. And it's also why I keep resisting the easy, yay, underdog wins, framing. This story is more poisonous than that. In a good way. It's sweet on the surface, bitter underneath. Another rehook that I think matters: if a god can erase a rampaging criminal, why hasn't it erased the people who run the Empire's cruelty? That question, if the show ever lets a character ask it out loud, would explode the narrative in the best way. Because it challenges the idea that divine intervention equals moral justice. Maybe the god doesn't care about cruelty. Maybe it cares about something else. Maybe it intervenes selectively. Maybe it's using the Empire. Maybe it's punishing the North. Maybe it's baiting Lucian. The uncertainty is the fuel. And fuel needs a spark. That spark, structurally, is usually a turning point where characters stop being able to maintain the status quo. The tournament can't just keep tournamenting. The investigation can't just keep investigating. The court can't just keep smiling. At some point, the lie collapses or hardens into oppression. What I appreciate is that the show's setup makes both outcomes plausible. The Empire could collapse under divine pressure. Or it could become harsher, more paranoid, more controlling. Fantasy stories often go for collapse because it's exciting. But the truly chilling path is hardening. Because hardened empires don't collapse gracefully, they crack down. They create enemies. They intensify propaganda. They tighten surveillance. And in that environment, Lucian's power becomes even more dangerous, not just because he can do something godlike, but because he becomes the pretext. The Empire can say, "We must protect ourselves from unknown magic," and suddenly everyone's freedom shrinks. Isolde would feel that shrink first. Women in courts always feel crackdowns first. Their bodies become policy faster than anyone else's. So if the Empire reacts to the divine event by tightening control, Isolde's tournament becomes less like a tradition and more like a handcuff. And that would force her to act. That's where the drama's emotional center could snap into place, Isolde deciding whether she is willing to be sacrificed to keep the Empire stable. Lucian deciding whether he is willing to be used to keep the Empire stable. Cale deciding whether stability is worth truth. Those are the choices that define the story, more than any spell. And the show's title keeps whispering that strength might not look like what the Empire thinks it looks like. Sometimes strength is a refusal. Sometimes strength is a quiet alliance. Sometimes strength is a princess choosing a future that embarrasses everyone. Sometimes strength is a loser deciding he will not be the Empire's solution. There's a particular satisfaction I get from stories where the main Lemah person doesn't just reveal strength, but reveals how pathetic the powerful were for needing them all along. Not in a petty way, but in a truth way. Like, oh, you built a world where you could laugh at him. And now your world depends on him. Sit with that. But again, the show has to land that without making it cartoonish. If Lucian turns into a smug Avenger too quickly, it loses the emotional realism. The best version is the one where Lucian's strength doesn't erase his scars. Where being strong doesn't magically fix the damage of being treated as nothing. Because that's the truth. Power doesn't automatically heal you. Sometimes it just gives your pain a megaphone. And I'm going to stop myself right there before I start sounding like I'm reading poetry at a campfire, because I promise I'm still a person sitting on my couch going, oh no, they're going to try to own him, aren't they, and then immediately getting mad on his behalf. One more quick human detour: anytime a court drama introduces a tournament, I start mentally ranking the inevitable, sly noble who thinks he's clever characters in my head. You know the type. The ones who smile like they invented smiling. The show absolutely understands that archetype exists, and it uses the court's smugness as a kind of ambient antagonist. Even if no single noble is named as the big bad in the premise, the court as a collective is already villainous enough to keep tension alive. So where does that leave me, emotionally, as a viewer in this middle stretch of the story? Hooked, but also wary. Hooked because the premise is strong and the thematic web is rich. Wary because the show has to keep making brave choices. It can't retreat into safe fantasy comfort. If it does, it'll feel like wasted potential. But if it keeps pushing, keeps letting the divine event poison the court's rituals, keeps letting Lucien's reveal complicate every relationship, keeps letting Isolde grow teeth, then it has the chance to become the kind of drama people argue about for months, the kind where you're not just shipping characters, you're debating what they owe each other. And honestly, those debates are half the fun. Because you can already see the fault lines. Some viewers are going to side with Kale's, we need control, logic, because unpredictability is scary and institutions exist for a reason. Some viewers are going to side with Lucien's, you don't get to own me, instinct, because the Empire has not earned trust. Some viewers are going to focus on Isolde and argue that her choice, whatever it becomes, is the real revolution, because changing who sits beside the throne changes everything. And the show is smart enough to feed all those readings without collapsing into a single obvious moral. That's a good sign. It also means the show's endgame, whenever it arrives, has to reconcile those fault lines in a way that feels emotionally honest, not just plot efficient. The divine mystery can't just be solved like a math problem. It has to matter to character. It has to change them. Lucien can't just be revealed as powerful and then remain the same man. Isolde can't just be dragged through a tournament and then remain the same symbol. Kale can't just investigate and then remain the same authority. Change is the payoff. And right now, you can feel change approaching, because the court's relationship to Lucien is already shifting from mockery to anxiety, and anxiety is the precursor to cruelty, and cruelty is the precursor to rebellion, and rebellion is the precursor to either liberation or tragedy, and the way the show keeps framing Isolde's stillness as something active rather than passive makes me think she's not going to stay still forever, because nobody who's truly awake stays still in a burning room, and if Lucien's presence is the spark that finally makes the Empire's lies visible to her, not just intellectually but viscerally, then the next stage of this drama isn't going to be about who wins a tournament at all but about who dares to rewrite the meaning of worth in a world that has been grading people like products for so long that it forgot what a person even is, and Kale, standing between the institution and the anomaly, is going to be forced to choose whether he's a guardian of the realm or just a guard of the cage. Because those roles look identical until the moment someone tries to walk out.